The autumn sun was setting over Cedar Grove when Mrs. Wilson pulled her silver Honda into the grocery store parking lot. After 20 years on the police force, even simple errands like grocery shopping came with an instinctive awareness of her surroundings. She'd earned her detective badge through hard work and dedication, building a reputation as one of the department's most respected officers. Today was supposed to be her day off, but she still carried her badge in her purse. Old habits die hard. She was wearing comfortable clothes, dark blue jeans, and her favorite cream-colored sweater, her curly hair tied back neatly. The only hint of her profession was the small police support pin on her sweater lapel, a gift from her son who had followed in her footsteps and now served as a sheriff in the neighboring county. As she walked toward the store entrance, a police cruiser pulled up alongside her car, its lights flashing. Officer Reed stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt. Mrs. Wilson recognized him from department meetings, though they'd never worked together directly. She'd heard whispers about his conduct, but had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" Reed's voice carried across the parking lot, sharp and demanding. Several shoppers stopped to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Wilson turned, maintaining her professional composure. "Yes, officer." "Is there a problem?" She reached for her purse, intending to show her badge. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Reed barked, his hand moving to his weapon. "We've had reports of a suspicious person matching your description." A small crowd began to gather, many pulling out their phones. Mrs. Wilson could feel their eyes on her, but she remained calm, drawing from her years of experience in tense situations. "Officer Reed, I'm Detective Wilson from the Cedar Grove PD. I have my badge right here in my purse." Reed stepped closer, his stance aggressive. "Sure you are. And I'm the chief of police. Step away from the vehicle." Mrs. Wilson's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but there seems to be a misunderstanding. I've served this community for 20 years. You can call it in to verify my credentials." The situation was escalating quickly. Reed's body camera light wasn't on, a clear violation of department policy. A young woman in the crowd started recording with her phone, while an elderly gentleman stepped forward, concern evident on his face. "Officer, I know this lady," the gentleman spoke up. "She helped my grandson last year when—" "Step back, sir," Reed interrupted. "This is police business." Mrs. Wilson could see the growing tension in the crowd. She'd been on both sides of this scenario throughout her career, but never like this. She thought of her son, of the conversations they'd had about changing the system from within, about maintaining dignity even in the face of injustice. "Officer Reed," she said firmly, "I'm going to reach for my badge very slowly. You can watch me do it. We can resolve this professionally." But Reed had already made up his mind. He moved forward, hand still on his weapon. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." His voice carried a tone she'd heard too many times before, one that suggested this was about power, not law enforcement. The crowd grew larger, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder. Mrs. Wilson stood her ground, but kept her movements slow and deliberate. She was no longer just a police detective in this moment. She was every person who'd ever faced prejudice behind a badge, every officer who'd upheld their oath with honor, and every parent who taught their children to stand tall in the face of injustice. The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. What should have been a simple trip to the grocery store was about to become something much more significant. A moment that would shine a light on deep-rooted issues within the department and spark a movement for change that would reach far beyond Cedar Grove's city limits. Things took a dark turn in the parking lot as Officer Reed ignored every attempt at reasonable conversation. The evening air grew colder, matching the chill that ran down Mrs. Wilson's spine as Reed grabbed her arm roughly. She didn't resist. Her years of training had taught her that escalating the situation would only make things worse. "I said turn around." Reed's voice carried across the parking lot, drawing even more attention. The crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones recording the unfolding scene. Some were calling out in protest, but most stood in shocked silence, watching a fellow law enforcement officer being treated like a criminal. Mrs. Wilson kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "Officer, you're making a mistake. My ID and badge are in my purse. Just let me show you." "Shut up." Reed cut her off, twisting her arm behind her back. The metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists as he fastened them too tight. The crowd gasped, and someone shouted, "This isn't right." The young woman who had been recording stepped forward bravely. "I'm streaming this live," she announced, her voice shaking but determined. "Everything you're doing is being recorded." Reed seemed to falter for a moment, but then his face hardened. He looked around the parking lot, his eyes settling on a row of trash bins near the store's loading dock. With a rough shove, he forced Mrs. Wilson to walk toward them. "Since you want to act suspicious in our community," Reed sneered, "you can wait here while I run your plates." He secured the handcuffs to a metal post next to the bins, leaving her standing there like a display of his authority. The humiliation burned worse than the metal cutting into her wrists. Mrs. Wilson had spent her entire career building bridges between the police and the community. Now she stood as a living example of everything wrong with the system she tried to improve. An older couple who had been grocery shopping hurried to their car. "We're calling your son," the woman called out. "Don't worry, we know he's the sheriff. Help is coming." More people gathered, their phones recording everything. A store employee came out with a bottle of water, but Reed warned him to stay back. The young man looked helplessly at Mrs. Wilson, then hurried inside, presumably to call for help. "Officer Reed." Mrs. Wilson tried one more time, her professional training still holding despite the situation. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't just about me. This is about everything we're supposed to stand for as law enforcement." But Reed wasn't listening. He paced back and forth, occasionally barking at people to stay back, his hand never far from his weapon. His body camera remained off, but at least 20 phones were capturing his every move. The evening grew darker, and the store's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene. Mrs. Wilson stood tall despite her position, her dignity intact even as Reed tried to strip it away. She thought about all the times she talked to her son about changing things from within the system, about being better than those who abused their power. A group of teenagers had gathered nearby, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. One of them, voice trembling with emotion, called out, "My mom knows you from the community center. You helped us set up the youth program." More voices joined in, sharing stories of how Mrs. Wilson had helped them or their families over the years. Each story was like a shield against Reed's attempts to degrade her. The community she'd served for so long was standing with her, bearing witness to this injustice, but also to her strength. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Reed's face twitched with the first sign of uncertainty. The crowd's energy shifted. Help was coming. Mrs. Wilson closed her eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer not just for herself, but for every person who had ever stood where she was standing, without a community to speak up for them. The world would soon see what happened in this parking lot. But more importantly, they would see how a community came together, how dignity prevailed over degradation, and how sometimes the strongest response to hate is standing tall in the face of it, surrounded by the people you've served and protected all along. The sheriff was in the middle of paperwork when his phone buzzed with an urgent message. A video link popped up, followed immediately by several frantic texts from community members he knew well. As the video began playing on his screen, his heart nearly stopped. There was his mother, handcuffed to a post next to garbage bins in the grocery store parking lot. He grabbed his keys and badge, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "Get 2 units to the Main Street grocery store, now," he commanded into his radio as he rushed to his vehicle. His deputies, hearing the urgency in his voice, responded immediately. The drive that usually took 15 minutes felt like hours. His mind raced with thoughts of all the conversations he'd had with his mother about police reform, about making real change from positions of power. She'd inspired him to become sheriff, to be the kind of leader who could make a difference. Now she was the one suffering from the very abuse of power they'd fought against. His phone kept buzzing with updates from concerned citizens. The live stream was spreading quickly across social media. People were gathering at the scene, standing witness to the injustice, but maintaining peace, just as his mother had always taught the community to do. "Chief, I'm 5 minutes out," he radioed to the local police chief. "Officer Reed is out of line and needs to be removed from the scene immediately." The chief's voice crackled back, "Already on my way. This isn't what we stand for." As the sheriff's car rounded the corner, he could see the crowd had grown even larger. The store's parking lot lights illuminated the scene like a stage. His mother stood tall despite her position, her dignity intact even in handcuffs. The sight made his chest tighten with both pride and pain. He pulled up with lights flashing but no siren. No need to escalate the situation further. 2 of his deputy vehicles arrived at the same time, their presence professional but firm. The crowd parted to let them through, many people nodding in recognition and relief. Officer Reed's stance changed as soon as he saw the sheriff's vehicle. His hand dropped from his weapon, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed his face. The sheriff stepped out of his car, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. "Officer Reed," his voice carried across the parking lot, steady and authoritative. "Step away from the detective. Now." Reed's face flushed red, but he took a step back. The sheriff approached his mother first, his heart breaking at the sight of the 2 tight handcuffs. He took out his keys, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Detective, I apologize for this disgraceful treatment. You'll be released immediately." The crowd watched in complete silence as he carefully removed the handcuffs. His mother rubbed her wrists but maintained her professional composure, a testament to her years of service and strength of character. The police chief arrived just then, his face grim as he took in the scene. 2 senior officers immediately moved to separate Officer Reed from the scene, reading him his rights as they did so. The crowd began to applaud, but the sheriff raised his hand for quiet. His mother touched his arm gently. "Remember what we always say," she whispered. "Change comes from handling things the right way, not from letting anger take over." The sheriff nodded, turning to address the gathered crowd. "Thank you all for being here, for recording, for standing up for what's right. This isn't just about what happened here tonight. This is about making sure it never happens to anyone else." People began sharing their recordings with the deputies, while others came forward to give statements. The grocery store manager brought out chairs and water for everyone involved. What had started as an attempt to humiliate one person had transformed into a moment of community unity and strength. As his mother gave her official statement to a senior detective, the sheriff looked around at the gathered faces, young and old, from all walks of life. They weren't just witnesses to an incident. They were participants in a moment that would lead to real change. This wasn't the way he'd wanted it to happen, but he knew that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for change comes from the darkest moments. The next few hours moved like a carefully choreographed dance. Inside the grocery store's break room, which had been turned into a temporary command center, the sheriff organized the response with practiced precision. His mother sat nearby, sipping tea brought by the store manager, while giving her official statement to 2 senior detectives. "Walk me through it again," the lead detective said gently, his notebook open. "Every detail matters." Though his mother's voice remained steady, the sheriff could see the slight tremor in her hands as she recounted the incident. 20 years of solving crimes, and now she was the victim in a case that was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Outside, the crowd had thinned but not disappeared. Many stayed to give statements, forming an orderly line as deputies collected video evidence from their phones. The young woman who'd started the live stream was still there, helping others upload their footage to a secure police server. "Your mom taught me in the Citizens Police Academy," one older gentleman told the sheriff as he handed over his phone. "She always said the badge was about protecting people, not power. Guess she proved that today, even from the other side of it." The store's security cameras had captured everything from multiple angles. The tech team was already downloading the footage, their faces grim as they watched Officer Reed's actions play out on their screens. His body camera's mysterious malfunction would be another piece of the investigation. The police chief paced the break room, his face a mask of controlled anger. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he said, stopping to look at the sheriff and his mother. "This is about every time someone looked the other way, every complaint that got buried, every warning sign we missed." Mrs. Wilson straightened in her chair, her professional instincts taking over despite her ordeal. "Then let's make sure something good comes from this. The community needs to see that the system can work when it's handled right." The sheriff nodded, thinking of all the cases he'd handled over the years. "We do this by the book," he announced to the room. "Every interview recorded, every piece of evidence logged. No shortcuts, no cover-ups, no rushing to judgment. We show everyone how real police work should be done." A young deputy stuck her head in the door. "Sir, the media is starting to arrive. They're requesting statements." The sheriff looked at his mother, who gave him a slight nod. "Tell them we'll have a press conference tomorrow morning. Tonight is about doing this right, not about cameras and headlines." More officers arrived from neighboring districts to help process the scene and statements. Some had worked with Mrs. Wilson over the years, and their faces showed a mix of respect and anger at what had happened to one of their own. The store manager appeared with sandwiches and coffee for everyone. "We're staying open as long as you need the space," he said. "My cameras caught everything. That officer, he's done this before. Just never to someone who could fight back." The sheriff's phone buzzed with messages from other police departments, offering support and resources for the investigation. The thin blue line was supposed to protect good officers, not cover for bad ones, and tonight had drawn that line clearly in the sand. As midnight approached, Mrs. Wilson finally stood up, her statement complete. "I need to go home," she said quietly. The sheriff could see the exhaustion setting in, the adrenaline wearing off. But before they could leave, she turned to address the room. "Thank you all," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her years of service. "Not just for tonight, but for showing that most officers remember their real duty, to serve and protect everyone, equally and fairly. Tomorrow, we start making sure this never happens again." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a promise. The sheriff gathered his files, knowing that tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges: press conferences, internal investigations, community meetings. But tonight had shown him something powerful. When good people stood together, even the darkest moments could light the way to real change. Morning brought a different kind of storm. The sheriff arrived at his office at dawn to find his inbox flooded with emails, his phone buzzing with messages from reporters and community leaders. The video had gone viral overnight, sparking discussions about police conduct across the country. In the conference room, his team had set up a command center for the investigation. Boards lined the walls, filled with photos, timelines, and witness statements. What started as one incident was unveiling a troubling pattern. "We found 6 similar complaints against Officer Reed in the past year," a detective reported, pinning another document to the board. "All filed by minority women, all dismissed due to lack of evidence." His body camera had convenient malfunctions during those incidents too. The sheriff studied the complaints, his jaw tightening. Each case followed a similar pattern: traffic stops or street encounters that turned aggressive, missing footage, witnesses too scared to speak up. But this time was different. This time, there was no hiding the truth. His mother had insisted on coming to work, despite his protests that she should rest. Now she sat in the corner of the conference room, reviewing old case files with a determined focus. "These women deserve justice too," she said without looking up. "Every single one of them." The morning press conference loomed ahead. Outside, news vans lined the street, and a crowd had already gathered. Community members holding signs demanding change, retired officers showing support, families of other victims coming forward with their stories. The police chief arrived, looking like he hadn't slept. "Internal Affairs found something," he said, dropping a thick folder on the table. "Reed's personal phone records. He was part of a private chat group with officers from other districts. The messages, they're not good." The investigation was growing bigger by the hour. What started as one incident was pulling back the curtain on years of overlooked problems. The sheriff knew they had to handle this carefully, not just for justice, but for real, lasting change. A community liaison officer knocked on the door. "Sir, the victims from the other cases are here. They saw the video and want to tell their stories. They're saying Mrs. Wilson gave them the courage to come forward." The sheriff looked at his mother, who was already standing up. "I'll talk to them," she said. "They need to know they're not alone anymore." In another corner of the room, tech experts were analyzing footage from Reed's previous arrests, looking for patterns and violations. Each new piece of evidence added to a picture that should have been clear long ago. "Chief," one analyst called out, "we found something in the metadata of Reed's body camera. The malfunctions weren't accidents. Someone manually disabled the recording feature. And not just on his camera." The implications were heavy. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about a system that needed fixing from the inside out. The sheriff's phone buzzed again, the governor's office this time. The story had reached state level, and they wanted answers. But real answers would take time, thorough investigation, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. A young officer brought in more coffee and paused by the evidence board. "My academy class had Mrs. Wilson as an instructor," she said quietly. "She always told us our badge was a promise to the community, not a shield from accountability." The morning sun streamed through the windows, lighting up the room where so many dedicated officers were working to right a wrong. Outside, the crowd had grown, but it remained peaceful. A community united in demanding change while showing faith in those working to make it happen. As the hour of the press conference approached, the sheriff looked around the room at his team. Good officers committed to real justice. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, it felt like genuine change was possible. His mother caught his eye and nodded. They both knew that sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest changes. Today, they would start turning this incident into a catalyst for reform that would protect not just their community, but communities everywhere. The press conference was set to begin in 30 minutes, but inside the police headquarters, resistance was brewing. A group of older officers gathered in the break room, their whispered conversations growing heated. They'd worked with Officer Reed for years, and some were more concerned about protecting their own than facing the truth. "You're going too far with this," one senior sergeant told the sheriff, stepping into his office. "Reed made a mistake, sure, but turning this into a witch hunt? You're putting targets on all our backs." The sheriff stood up slowly, his voice calm but firm. "A mistake is writing the wrong date on a report. What happened in that parking lot was no mistake. And if standing up for what's right puts a target on my back, then so be it." Down the hall, more complaints echoed. Some officers worried about their old cases being reopened. Others feared the spotlight this investigation was shining on department practices. The tension in the building was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Wilson walked through these groups with her head held high. 20 years on the force had taught her every face in that building. Who could be trusted, who would resist change, who might need a gentle push in the right direction. She stopped by the desk of a younger officer who looked troubled. "Having doubts?" she asked quietly. The young officer glanced up. "My partner. He's telling me to keep quiet about some things I've seen. Says it's about loyalty." "True loyalty?" Mrs. Wilson replied, "is to the badge and what it stands for, not to those who dishonor it." In the conference room, the investigation team continued their work despite the growing opposition. Evidence boards now covered every wall, each one revealing connections that couldn't be ignored. Reed's misconduct was just the tip of the iceberg. The police chief burst in, his face red. "We've got problems. The union rep is threatening to fight this. Says we're conducting an unauthorized witch hunt without proper cause." The sheriff remained unmoved. "Show him the evidence. All of it. Let him try to defend this." A knock at the door interrupted them. A detective entered, carrying a stack of files. "Sir, more victims are coming forward, not just from Reed's cases. They're reporting similar incidents from other officers too. The pattern goes back years." The resistance grew louder outside. Some officers were threatening to walk out, claiming the investigation was destroying department morale. Others stood their ground, knowing that real change always faced opposition. Mrs. Wilson gathered these supportive officers in the briefing room. "I've worn this badge as long as some of you have been alive," she told them. "I've seen good cops stay quiet because they feared speaking up. That ends today." The sheriff checked his watch. 20 minutes until a press conference. His phone buzzed with a message. The mayor wanted him to tone down his statement to protect the city's image. He deleted the message without replying. Through the windows, he could see the crowd outside growing larger. Community members held signs supporting police reform, while others simply stood in silent witness. Among them were faces he recognized, people his mother had helped over the years, families of other victims, citizens demanding change. "It's time," his mother said, appearing at his door. She'd changed into her full-dress uniform, every medal and commendation in place. "They need to see that standing up for what's right isn't betraying the badge, it's honoring it." The sheriff gathered his papers, knowing that what he was about to say would make him both enemies and allies. But as he walked toward the press room, officers began falling in line behind him. First a few, then more, then dozens. Each step echoed with purpose. These were the ones who remembered their original oath, to protect and serve all citizens equally. They were ready to face the hard truths, to make real changes, to rebuild trust with their community one brave step at a time. The community meeting hall was packed to overflowing. People stood along the walls, sat in aisles, and gathered outside around speakers that had been set up to accommodate the overflow crowd. The air was thick with anticipation and hope for real change. Mrs. Wilson took the podium, her police uniform crisp and professional. The bruises on her wrists were still visible, a reminder of what had brought them all here. But her voice was strong as she addressed the crowd. "I've served this community for 2 decades," she began. "I've seen the best and worst of our system. What happened to me in that parking lot wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a culture that needs to change." The crowd listened in respectful silence as she shared her story. Behind her sat rows of officers, those who had chosen to stand for reform rather than hide behind the blue wall of silence. Each wore a new pin on their uniform, a small shield with the words, "Serve with honor," engraved on it. A young girl raised her hand during the question period. "My mom was stopped by police last month," she said, her voice trembling. "She was scared to report it. What's different now?" The sheriff stepped forward, his face serious but kind. "Today, we're announcing new policies. Every complaint will be investigated by an independent board. Body cameras can't be turned off during any interaction. And most importantly, officers who report misconduct will be protected, not punished." Community leaders took turns speaking, sharing stories and suggestions. A retired teacher talked about creating bridges between police and local schools. A shop owner proposed regular meetings between business owners and patrol officers. Each idea was noted and added to the action plan. Mrs. Wilson's phone buzzed with messages from other departments across the country. Her story had sparked similar conversations everywhere. Other officers who had faced discrimination were finding their voices, supported by colleagues who refused to stay silent any longer. The police chief stood up to announce practical changes. Starting next week, all officers will undergo new training. We're bringing in experts on bias awareness. Our promotion system is being revamped to reward community engagement, not just arrest numbers. And we're establishing a citizens review board with real power to oversee these changes. In the back of the room, some of the older officers who had initially resisted shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Change wasn't easy, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Several had already turned over information about past incidents, choosing truth over misplaced loyalty. A community organizer took the mic. "We don't want to fight the police," she said clearly. "We want to work with officers who remember their real duty, to protect and serve everyone equally. Today feels like a new beginning." Mrs. Wilson watched as people from all parts of the community, different backgrounds, ages, and experiences, came together to build something better. The shame of that night in the parking lot was transforming into a force for positive change. The sheriff outlined the next steps: weekly progress reports, open community meetings, a new anonymous reporting system. But most importantly, a commitment to making sure no one else would have to stand handcuffed and humiliated just because someone with a badge abused their power. As the meeting continued, small groups formed to discuss specific issues. Officers sat with community members, really listening to their concerns and experiences. The walls between us and them began to crack and crumble. Outside, the media captured it all. But this wasn't just another news story about police misconduct. This was a story about a community coming together to demand better, and about good officers brave enough to stand up for real change. Mrs. Wilson stayed late, talking with anyone who wanted to share their story. Each conversation reinforced what she had always believed: that true justice depended on building bridges, not walls. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but looking around the room at all these people working together, she knew they were finally heading in the right direction. 3 months had passed since that night in the parking lot. The police station buzzed with activity, but it was different now. The walls that once held generic motivational posters now displayed community artwork and photos from joint police community events. The change wasn't just on the walls, it was in the air itself. Mrs. Wilson sat in the new transparency office, reviewing the latest batch of officer body camera footage. The monitoring system she helped design was working. Every interaction was recorded, every complaint thoroughly investigated. On her desk sat a stack of letters from other police departments, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. "You need to see this," the sheriff said, walking in with a tablet. He pulled up a video from last night's traffic stop. In it, a young officer handled a tense situation perfectly: calm, professional, and respectful. The driver, initially afraid, ended up thanking the officer for her approach. "That's one of our new recruits," Mrs. Wilson smiled. She went through the reform training program. The new training emphasized de-escalation, cultural awareness, and community connection. Every officer now spent time working with local community groups before hitting the streets. Down the hall, the weekly community oversight meeting was in session. Regular citizens sat alongside officers, reviewing policies and suggesting improvements. Today's topic was the success of the new Neighborhood Liaison Program, where officers were assigned to specific communities to build lasting relationships. "Remember how some people said these changes would make our job harder?" A veteran officer commented during his break. "Actually, it's easier now. People trust us more. They help us more. We're solving more cases because the community works with us, not against us." The evidence backed him up. Crime rates were down, but more importantly, community satisfaction was up. Other cities were sending observers to learn from their example. What started as a terrible incident had sparked a revolution in police-community relations. Mrs. Wilson's phone lit up with a message. Another victim of Officer Reed had just won her case. The systematic review of past incidents had uncovered dozens of similar cases, and each one was being carefully re-examined. Justice was slow, but it was finally coming. In the break room, officers chatted with community volunteers who now regularly brought home-cooked meals to share. The walls between police and public were coming down, one conversation at a time. Even some of the most resistant officers had started to embrace the changes, seeing how much easier their jobs became when the community was on their side. 6 new departments adopting our reforms next month, the police chief announced, walking through with a newspaper. Their success story had made headlines again, but this time for all the right reasons. The article highlighted how their model was spreading across the country. The sheriff stood at his office window, watching a group of officers playing basketball with local kids in the station's parking lot, the same lot where everything had started. The pickup games had become a regular thing, breaking down barriers and building trust in the most natural way possible. Mrs. Wilson joined him, her eyes on the scene below. Sometimes, she said quietly, good things grow in unexpected places. The healing process hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. Outside, a new batch of recruits arrived for their community orientation. They would spend their first week not learning about weapons or tactics, but meeting community leaders, visiting local organizations, and understanding the people they would serve. The station's front desk, once protected by thick glass, was now open and welcoming. Photos of officers at community events lined the walls, along with artwork from local schools. Every change, big and small, sent the same message. This was a place of protection and service for everyone. As the day wound down, Mrs. Wilson gathered her things to head home. On her desk sat a framed photo from last week's community picnic. Officers and citizens together, not as separate groups, but as one community. That image, more than any policy or procedure, showed how far they'd come. 1 year had passed since that fateful night in the parking lot. The courthouse was filled to capacity for the final hearing. Mrs. Wilson sat in the front row, her son the sheriff beside her, as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict that would close this chapter of their journey. Officer Reed sat at the defendant's table, no longer in uniform. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, not just from that night, but from years of similar incidents that had finally come to light. The investigation had uncovered a pattern that couldn't be ignored. "All rise," called the bailiff. The judge, a respected figure known for her fairness, took her seat. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "This case," she said, "is about more than one incident or one officer. It's about the responsibility we give to those who wear the badge and what happens when that trust is broken." She paused, looking directly at Reed. "But it's also about how a community can come together to create positive change from a moment of darkness." The verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. But more important than the punishment was what had grown from that incident. The judge acknowledged the sweeping reforms that had transformed the police department, now a national model for community-oriented policing. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Not in anger this time, but in celebration of how far they'd come. Local news crews interviewed community members who shared stories of positive changes they'd seen in their neighborhoods. Mrs. Wilson stepped out into the sunlight, surrounded by fellow officers who had supported the changes. Many wore the new community service medals that had been created to recognize officers who went above and beyond in building relationships with the people they served. A young officer approached her, tears in her eyes. "Your story changed everything," she said. "When I was in the academy, I was afraid to speak up about things I saw. Now we know we have support if we do the right thing." The sheriff checked his phone. Messages were pouring in from departments across the country. Their success story had inspired others to make similar changes. What started as one incident in a grocery store parking lot had sparked a movement. At the community center later that day, a celebration brought together officers and citizens. Children played safely, parents chatted with patrol officers they now knew by name, and elderly residents shared stories with rookie cops who listened eagerly to their wisdom. Mrs. Wilson watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The trauma of that night had turned into something powerful, a force for real change. Her son, the sheriff, had helped create new policies that were being adopted nationwide. The Wilson Protocols, they were calling them. Guidelines for building trust between police and community. The old guard who had initially resisted the changes now admitted they were wrong. Crime rates had dropped, officer satisfaction was up, and the community felt safer than ever. Even the most skeptical had to acknowledge that treating everyone with dignity made their jobs easier and more effective. As evening fell, Mrs. Wilson stood to address the gathering. A year ago, she began, "I stood handcuffed in a parking lot. Today, I stand here seeing what can happen when good people refuse to let darkness win. This isn't the end of our journey. It's just the beginning." The crowd applauded, but she raised her hand for quiet. The real victory isn't in the courtroom. It's right here, in every conversation between an officer and a citizen, in every moment of trust built, in every child who now waves to police officers instead of fearing them. The celebration continued into the evening, but it wasn't just a party. It was a community coming together, stronger for having faced its problems honestly. The path forward was clear, not always easy, but always worth the effort. As the stars came out, Mrs. Wilson and her son stood watching families head home, officers chatting with neighbors, and children playing without fear. Sometimes, she thought, the darkest moments really do lead to the brightest changes. All it takes is enough brave people willing to stand up and say, "This is how we make things right."